So you'd have people hackers that would create services that performed activities on a system, pretending and masquerading to have the authority and credential of privileged processes, which allowed them to have access to resources that normally they would be isolated from. And this is what allowed those processes to get to things and do things that a person couldn't, because the security was really at the user level, not at the hardware level. So consequently, we need to do proper authentication and authorization of any subject, users, programs, or processes. And first off, that starts off with whether it's a user, program, or process, they need to identify who they are. And now we need to then validate that identity. And that's the process of authentication. If we don't do good authentication, then anybody can masquerade as having more authority than what they actually have. So the better job we do at authentication, the better job we'll do at authorizing only the right access. If you don't do a good job at authentication, your authorization is potentially compromised. You let people into the party that you shouldn't. So authentication needs to be performed very carefully. We have 3 factors of authentication that we discuss: something you have, something you know, something you are. And if you use any 2 of those 3 in combination, we're said to be using strong authentication. So if, for example, you need to input a password, but also have a thumbprint on your mobile phone, for example, that's 2-factor authentication. The reason why we get sent codes to our cell phone is because the cell phone is something we have. And when we can input a code that we received on that cell phone, then that validates to the other side that we are in possession of that cell phone in addition to the password that we knew that we just provided. 2-factor authentication. So something you have, something you know, something you are. Strong authentication, any 2 of the 3. For example, the example you might see in your exam is a smart card using a user's PIN. That's something you have and something you know. Authentication with passwords is very, very common, but also very, very weak. ISACA recommends that we have an automated password management tool. You know, like when you go to set your password and they say, you can't use a common word like that. It needs to be more complicated. Well, that is a password management tool that is enforcing that. Authentication with passwords, you can have cognitive passwords, which are fact or opinion-based information. What is your mother's maiden name, for example? We have what we call one-time passwords or dynamic passwords, such as those codes that are being sent to your phone that prove you have possession of that phone. So one-time passwords, those codes should change for every login. They're dynamic. Other authentication methods could be memory cards, smart cards. So if we do a good job, an excellent job at authenticating, then we're going to do a better job at only authorizing appropriate access because we authenticated so well. Moreover, if we authenticated very, very well, I even took a blood sample from you. I've got you with genetics. Not only will that allow me to do great authorization and access control, but also what it does is you can never later deny that you did something if that activity was tracked after that level of authentication. You can never say that it was somebody that acted like me who said they were me, but they weren't really me. So consequently, strong authentication, thorough authentication allows us to enforce better assurance and accountability. So this is the relationship between identification, authentication, and authorization. You'll need to know the difference and how they work together. Access control principles, again, access level control is what restricts users to only doing functions they're authorized to do. This is just, again, a whole bunch of different procedures that ISACA recommends as best practices, just loose, arbitrary. We like this one, that you'll need to memorize for your exam. Again, you'll know this by looking at your slides and saying, wow, So if somebody asks me, what should be performed by the application owners to ensure that adequate segregation of duties exists between IS and end users? You would be looking for the answer that said authorization of access to data should be performed. And you would be right. So again, that's just, another exam taking tip of how I created this slide deck so you can use it to prepare yourself for that exam. It's a lot of rote memorization, but it works. You won't feel proud of your work, neither will I, but it'll achieve goal, and that's the important thing. So why won't we feel proud? Because we maybe didn't learn so much, but my gosh, we did get certified. If you want to learn stuff, come back and attend with me on other sessions that aren't specifically geared to prepare you for an exam that sometimes is out of touch. Again, that's just not a statement as to fact. That's just an opinion. So that's not defamation. Moving along, logical access controls. Naming conventions for system resources are important for access control. What are we talking about here? You know how you can assign rights, privileges to groups? And matter of fact, within Microsoft Network Administration, we even can call them group policy objects. Oh yeah, so I didn't have to assign the access individually. I was able to assign it to a group and put everybody in that group, and then that gave them the inherited access. Yep, that's the long way. They're saying it the long way of how that works. OSI reference model overview. Oh my goodness, this harkens back to the first time I learned this was 1999, I think. The Open Systems Interconnect reference model overview. This was basically understanding networking of how to get information from an application and data processing level, a thought, if you will, all the way down into the electronic signals that traverse over a wire or via wireless. There's a process of converting that thought down into electrical impulses, and then from electrical impulses back to the thought. The Open Systems Interconnect reference model describes how to do that through a series of encapsulation. If you've studied this before and you're sitting there going, I can't believe he's going to attack this and try to teach OSI right here, right now. I'm not, and it's not because I don't know how or because I'm lazy, but also you don't need to know it that deeply. Turns out that we could spend a half an hour to an hour at least on this discussion, but ISACA is only going to have a couple of questions on it, and I'll show you what those are. You can answer those questions the way I tell you to, and you're going to pass them anyway, which is good. So your 7 layers that we have from the OSI reference model overview, I presented them in terms of how we also encapsulate them with data encapsulation, but we don't need to get into that at this point. Just know that your top 3 layers, your application layer, your presentation layer, your session layer, this explains what these layers are. Think of an application layer, for example, your web browser. You know that the front of a URL typically says HTTP : Well, that stands for an actual network communications protocol, HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Interesting. Well, that means that protocol is operating way up at the application level with a browser such as Chrome or Edge or something like that. In other words, it's a networking protocol, but applications know how it's good for applications to be able to use, and they can interface with that level of protocol. And a protocol, again, is a way of doing things. If you're in the military, you have to follow certain protocols of how you do things. Well, HTTP is a certain protocol of how you're going to manage sending text, data, and other information through the internet for the web purposes. So how browsers can talk over the network and communicate things to other browsers on other parts of the network. We have application layer protocols and how we do things. There's HTTP as an example, you'll see. Telnet, SMTP, Simple Mail Transport Protocol, DNS, SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol. Don't use that so much anymore. But at any rate, what are you going to need to know about all of this? you may need to know examples of an application layer protocol. You may not need to know what Telnet's for or what HTTP's for, but that could be categorized as an application layer protocol, and so on. So there is the possibility that you would need to memorize what examples of protocols go with which layers. But the most important thing, most likely you may not get questions about that, but surely what you will get is a question about where do we manage network traffic congestion? And you may not understand why, but you'll respond, why, that would be at the OSI Transport Layer. That's where we manage traffic congestion. Oh, really? Yep. We don't need to get into the technicalities of how. You don't need to understand datas and segments and packets and frames and bits. You just need to know that that is the transport layer where we manage traffic congestion. Likewise, it turns out part of its job is not just managing traffic congestion. Traffic congestion, meaning we're competing on a network to send information, and our little bits of information are running into each other and destroying each other on the roads, essentially. If you have traffic congestion, you know what you end up having? You end up having to rebuild pieces and things like this. And the transport layer, the protocols that operate at that layer are very good at understanding when collisions have occurred and how to handle them and how to rebuild things and so on. And also what it does is, since we're not be able to send out data as one chunk, we have to break it down into pieces and send out lots of pieces. Well, the problem is you always run the risk that some of the pieces won't get there. Moreover, if the other side is receiving a lot of pieces, it could be that some got there quicker than other pieces. How does the other side know how to put them back in order? Through sequence messages that are attached to those pieces. Whoa, that's more than I need to know. You're right, it is more than you need to know, because all you really need to know is, where do we address out of sequence messaging? Through segment sequencing. You'd say, that would be their transport layer. That's what it was. Yeah, the transport layer. Ding, ding, ding. You are correct. And you win on that question. So again, if I were teaching a full-on networking class, maybe for Cisco or Checkpoint or something like this, that we would go there, but we don't need to for this one. Network layer functions. Just like you need to know what happens at the transport layer, we need to understand that routing, how to actually, not just the physical carrying of the data, but where it goes and how it gets there is routing. That's handled at the network layer rather than the transport layer. The transport layer is the truck that carries information. The network layer is the driver with the map who knows how to get there. That's essentially what we're looking at there with the network layer functions. Routing occurs at the network layer. So again, transport layer functions, and recap, transport layer manages traffic congestion as well as out of sequence messages. TCP connection exploits and attacks. Because the way that the Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, operates to establish a communication session and partnership between the source and destination. Hey, brother, I'm going to be sending you a whole lot of pieces, and I'm going to start sequencing them. By the way, I'm starting my sequencing at 1. Because how can you put things back in sequence if you don't know how the sequence number system works? That kind of thing. So in other words, there's some back and forth communication between the source and destination before real information is ever sent. That back and forth communication to establish the agreement is vulnerable. Because it turns out that, again, just establishing a connection with our server, even if our server doesn't deliver any information, it had to do the work to establish the connection information to determine it didn't want to do the work. And that little bit of work counts. And again, I was able to find that if you're flooded with enough of those connection requests, why, you would be suffering perhaps from a synchronization or SYN flood attack. This is where I'm just sending, you can even do this with ping. The command ping to determine whether or not you reached a foreign host. Well, that little tiny ping command still established a TCP, a UDP connection to where it can actually require some processing. So consequently, we can actually perform a ping of death that isn't necessarily just about the TCP synchronization, but it also goes to when we're supposed to follow a protocol with pinging, that we're going to send a certain UDP size. And what if I don't follow that convention and I send something larger than what's normally allowed, but I also send a command not to fragment it? You say, but that won't work. It won't fit in the box. It won't fit in the box. Exactly. That makes the destination system start doing this because it doesn't like what's happening. And if you do it enough times using a botnet network to everybody attacks at the same time, why, you could cause that destination server that you're attacking to get so tied up, freaking out about all the bad traffic, that it can't serve other authorized users. And that will be generally categorized as a denial of service attack. And if a botnet network was involved, it would be more than just a simple denial of service attack. It would be a distributed denial of service attack, or a DDoS attack. Oh, look at that, DDoS attack. Well, Alan, what's a good example of a DDoS attack? Smurf attack. Ooh, how does that work? They don't ask you how a Smurf attack works. They just ask you which of the following is an example of a DDoS attack, and you need to select Smurf. You want to know more about Smurf? You can do it on your own time because you're so inquisitive, and just click on that link and go read about it, but you won't be tested to that depth, okay? So, network topology. Ooh, again, network topology is essentially just how all of your devices interconnect and connect together on the network. You don't need to study this in depth anymore, especially today when we do wireless ring topology, bus topology, star topology, mesh topology. A lot of this had to do when we were using wired networks. The one you need to know about, the answer, is going to be bus topology. What's the question? Don't worry about it. That's the answer. Now, the question is, they're going to ask, out of the topologies that are available, which one is most vulnerable to total loss if a single device fails? Well, the single device that could fail in a bus topology is the trunk line itself, the one that we all attach to, that we don't do anymore, that could fail. So think of it kind of like the old, well, I was about to go into talking about telecommunications party lines, but that would be opening up a whole new can of old-fashioned worms. Going on, LAN technologies. We have various technologies. This is getting down more at the data link layer, Ethernet technology, token ring technology, things like this. Again, do you need to know in depth all of this stuff? No, you don't. And I wouldn't even try to, because let's face it, I'm talking about 20 years of study here to know all of this stuff. But I can teach you what you need to know to pass the test. When they ask, which of the following detects the presence of bursts of errors in network transmissions? And you say, I'm thinking it's a cyclic redundancy check, a CRC value. Yeah. I don't know what that is, but I just got the answer right. Excellent. It is also commonly used to determine validity of data transfer. Because why? Because it's checking for completeness of data transmission. Again, do you need to know a lot about network address translation and how we use that to convert public addresses into private addresses and so forth? You might have one or two questions, but it won't be that in depth if you have them at all. Firewall gateways. You have different kinds of firewall gateways. One, the least sophisticated, is called a packet filtering firewall gateway. It operates at the network layer. You may remember that the network layer was involved with addressing. And so basically a packet filtering firewall says, I don't know what you've got in the truck. All I care about is where you're coming from and where you're going to. I see the address of where you come from. I see the address of where you're going to. And if I permit data coming from this source and I permit data going to that destination, why, I will let you pass. That is a packet filtering firewall. A simple router on a network can be configured to do packet filtering as a packet filtering firewall. Now then, the problem is that, again, just because of where I'm coming from and where I'm going is permitted doesn't mean that I should be able to get through with malicious intent or malicious actions, for example. So This is, for example, what if you have an internal person performing an attack on your internal network? They're authorized when they're from and to addresses, but they're doing bad things. If you want a device that will actually look into the traffic to peek in and see what they're doing more at the application layer of the OSI, you need a more sophisticated firewall. We have two firewalls for this, generically speaking, in broad categories. We have what is known as an application layer gateway, and it's called that because, coincidentally, it inspects traffic all the way up through the application layer protocol. Interesting. We also have another version that also goes through all 7 layers, and that is called stateful inspection. What's the difference? Well, technically in how they operate. An application layer gateway says, I'm going to receive this encapsulated information and I'm going to tear it all apart. I'm going to unpack that suitcase all the way down, just like you have at customs, just like you have at the TSA security at the airport. They tear through all of your stuff and then repack it and send it on its way. That's why it's also called a proxy firewall. That's what an application layer gateway does. It's very, very thorough, but it also works really hard, which means that it's resource intensive and could be a little bit slower than perhaps stateful inspection, which says I'm not going to unpack and repack things. I'm going to run it through basically the TSA X-ray machine, if you will. It's peeking in on the traffic without opening it and maintaining a state understanding of the information. Basically, what I'm talking about here is a checkpoint firewall. I wrote a couple of books on that once upon a time, but so long ago it probably doesn't even count anymore. So, wow, why do we need to know all this? Well, it's nice to have a basic understanding of these things. Know that a packet filtering firewall, because it's very simple and doesn't do much and doesn't work very hard. Well, because of that, it can also go very fast. It doesn't suffer much overhead because it's not unpacking or packing anything. Matter of fact, it's not watching anything but where you're coming from, where you're going to. And once it makes that decision, it stops thinking about it. Therefore, it's very fast. If you need a high performance, but if you need a high performance in terms of speed, but not necessarily in terms of security, that's going to be a packet filtering firewall. Proxy and stateful both inspect all the way through layer 7. Which one's better? Well, as my lawyer tells me, it depends. But ISACA won't get into the depends. ISACA does love its application layer gateway. Regardless of what you're considering or how you're looking at it, if you want a secure firewall, ISACA feels application layer gateway is the way to go. Checkpoint would beg to differ. But nonetheless, that is ISACA's world. So again, how do you know which one to go with? Hey, you want fast but less protection, packet filtering. You want more protection but a little bit slower, application layer gateway. And when do I use stateful inspection? You don't. That's not the answer. Keep moving. Firewall architecture. Where we position this filtering and this analysis actually has names. If you put a firewall or something that's looking at traffic out on the perimeter of your network, which, by the way, at home, that could be, well, your connection to the ISP. You've got lots of computers and stuff talking inside your house, perhaps, maybe even directly with each other. But when they want to go to the internet, they have to go through that ISP cable modem or perhaps fiber modem, whatever it is. It's not really modem, but we call it that. Modulation, demodulation. But the point is that is your last point before you go off to the untrusted internet. Well, if that is the last device, your last bastion of your internal network, guess what they call that? They call that a bastion host. That means that border routers are typically placed at domain boundaries, and they are called bastion hosts. If it has firewall on it, well, it can still be a bastion host because it's on the outer perimeter, the last bastion of your network. Now then, anything behind that bastion host, if it's performing screening like a firewall does, the host behind that bastion host, protected by that bastion host, would be called screened hosts. And if you have a whole network of screened hosts behind that packet filter, or that behind that firewall, that filtering bastion host, why, they would be said to be in a screened subnet. Ooh, there's a lot of stuff to memorize. Or you could just memorize the boldface italicized things that I pointed out and fluff your way, fake your way through that exam. So firewall architecture, again, just general best practices. Some of them are pretty obvious from what I've said. Why would you put a firewall in a place in your network that is not the last bastion between you and the untrusted internet? Meaning you put a firewall in a place where people go to the internet around it? Yeah, that's what I like. Well, then the firewall doesn't do much good, does it? The dilemma is that where is your bastion host today when so many people now have, well, connectivity through their mobile device? There's an untrusted network that is essentially connected to every trusted mobile phone within your employee population. And here's the thing. They have a button called hotspot. They just became their own bastion hosts to the big, bad, untrusted network. Network security has gotten much more difficult than it used to be due to advances in technology. So firewall risk indicators. One of them is you don't have a firewall, that you've got a poorly configured firewall. Measuring firewall effectiveness. ISACA has some ideas on this. If you track a higher number of attacks that are blocked, then that must mean you have a better firewall. Okay, or it just means that you're in a position to where you're open, that you're more viewable, that there's just more attackers around you. You're on a bad network segment, for example. ISACA says more attacks blocked means a better firewall, that kind of thing. Adequacy of firewall router configuration. How do you monitor its adequacy? Periodically testing with your own penetration test to see if you can get past your firewall when you shouldn't be. Testing it, if you will, just to see if it works right. So virtual private networks. Ooh, what is this? This is where we say, you know what? ISACA is going to say you want to connect geographically disparate organizations, but you want to do so in a protected, private, confidential way, but you don't want to pay for one of those expensive direct lease line connections. How can you communicate over a common network, but do so in a private way? I want to have not a private network, meaning I'm connected to you by our own hard cable, but more in a virtual kind of way. I want to connect to you over the internet, which is an internet we all share, but I want it to have my own channel. Think of it as my own frequency that only we can communicate on. That kind of thing. That would make it a virtual private network. Well, that's essentially what we create when we use VPN connections over the internet. What we're going to do is essentially think of it as, well, even if we all share the same highway system, getting from one city to the next, is it possible that I could take my precious sensitive information and lock it in the back of a vehicle that has no windows, that then drives across this public network of highways?